We've called out cultural appropriation, but have we really looked in the mirror? We've spent generations immersed in a European way of life, often disconnected from our own. So when do we stop masquerading in a culture that isn't truly ours and return to the roots that we demand others respect? It's time to give back what isn't ours and reclaim what is. In this episode, we explore Kindezi, the African way of family, where every generation nurtures, educates, and uplifts each other in the community. Let's uncover the wisdom of this tradition and how restoring it can transform the way we build, support, and sustain our families. This is Afrosynthesis. Ankh in my eye, hotel, peace, what's happening world? It's Ahasa. This is Afrosynthesis, and welcome back to the channel. This is episode 22, entitled Kindezi, the African way of family. But before we begin, let's revisit a bit last week's episode, where we talked about how culture is understood through the asili, which is the cultural seed, the utamawazo, which is the cultural worldview or way of thinking, and the utama roho, which is the spirit or the energy of a culture. We spoke about how Mama Marimba Ani mentioned and created these concepts to guide us in recognizing how deeply our culture and traditions and ways of thinking and feeling are shaped by the origins. A new understanding of time that I've recently come into is that time is the distance between the seed and its fruit. And so if we think about the fruit that we are living and that we are harvesting presently, and we ask ourselves that we don't like it, then we need to decide what seeds need to leave. And we talked about that a little bit last week. Tap into the episode 21 if you haven't. And we're going to continue on this week talking about some seeds that we need to plant, which is the seeds of the African way of family. One of the most evident differences between African and European cultures lies in the relationship of family, right? In the African tradition, family extends way beyond the physical. It also includes our ancestors and those yet to be born. I like to call the ancestors those who came before us. And of course, our children of the future, those yet to be born. And it also includes those like ourselves, the living. And each of us play a crucial role in this communal structure. So what happens when this natural balance is disrupted? What happens when external influences introduce division and competition and neglect? We've been living that reality. So today we're looking at Kindezi, which is the Congo or the Bantu Congo way of saying babysitting or caregiving. And we're going to look at Kindezi as a blueprint for restoring what has been lost. So it leads us to the question, what has been lost? In the African way of family, family is not just a unit. It is an interconnected web of relationships, both seen and unseen, familial and within the spatial, within the time and space that you're living in, right? Within arm's reach, so to speak, or down the street, right? Unlike Western family structures, which tend to prioritize the individual and the individual achievement and self-reliance, African societies understand that survival and prosperity come through collective effort. So again, when we look at the African family structure, we see three groups. And yes, you're going to hear me repeat this episode and throughout the other ones just that I have in the past, because we've listened to lies for so many years, so we can't get tired of hearing the truth too many times. The African family structure consists of three essential groups. We have the ancestors, who are the keepers of wisdom. They help guide us, the living, right, through our memory and our spiritual connection. We have us, the living, the active participants that help shape society and pass knowledge forward while caring for those before, our elders, and after us, our young ones. And then we have those yet to be born, the future generations whose well-being depends on the choices and sacrifices we make today. And so as you can see, within the living, you have the children, you have the adults, and you have the elders. And when we talk about the Kindezi, we're talking about these three parts of the living. Each of these phases of life has a duty, because the most critical element of our family structure is interdependence. And so we've talked about the European asili. If we contrast it with the European family model, aging parents, AKA the elders, they're displaced from the home. They're put in places like nursing homes. Children, the young ones, they're also displaced from the home. They're raised in places like daycares. And so the nuclear family is the primary focus, but not even so much as the nuclear family as much as those who are within the power of the, say, the prime of their life. Those who are in prime working ages. And so this fragmentation of family, it weakens the bonds that really sustain our community, right? Even in mythology, we can see this cultural difference. We talked about myth last week and how myth becomes mythoform, which then becomes ideology. So when we look at the European legends, they often depict adversarial relationships between parents and children, right? You have Kronos and Zeus. Check out their story and see how Kronos eats his children and kills them, but his mother hides Zeus, and Zeus comes back and does what? Kills his father and avenges things. You don't see that in African myth and story. We have a beautiful relationship, not this adversarial relationship with parents and with family. All right, the African traditions, they emphasize harmony, guidance, and mutual responsibility. And where there is major fallout, especially typically between siblings, you see redemption in the end. And so Kindezi is a book, Kindezi, The Congo Art of Babysitting, that was written by Dr. Fukiao. And it's beautiful, right? Because we spoke last week about Mama Marimba Ani, and she actually wrote the introduction to this work. And what they really share with us is that at the heart of the African family is Kindezi, which is a term that means the sacred art of babysitting or caregiving. And so in traditional African societies, the Ndeze, which is going to be the caretaker, right, the one who is helping in that process of Kindezi, they're highly respected, and they're entrusted with the development of the well-being specifically of children, right, because everybody is a child of someone. And so in the Bantu Congo language, the word for child is muntu or mantu, which is going to be the vital force. And so Kindezi and the Ndeze are the ones who are in charge with bringing forth and increasing and bringing to light the vital force that is within the child throughout the entirety of their life, right? And so these are not just babysitters. These are mentors, these are guides, and these are custodians of the culture. And so the act of caregiving was not just an obligation, something that you felt like you might be required to do. It was a spiritual duty. It was something that you wanted and you desired to be a part of because it was necessary for your growth and the growth of your being, which you see reflected in your family and those around you in your community, right? And so to be a caretaker in an African community meant more than just meeting somebody's physical needs and protecting their ability to be sheltered, fed, etc. Those are survival things. It was about instilling values, discipline, and an awareness and a consciousness of one's role within the greater society. And so children were not raised solely by their biological parents, right? They were raised by other elders in the family, their teachers, other members of the community, right? And they all together ensured that they developed with a strong moral and cultural foundation. We all know the phrase, like, it takes a village. But how many of us are actively looking and striving and contributing to our villages that we belong to, both familial and otherwise in community. So as you can see, this approach of Kindezi, it's not just beneficial for children, it strengthened the entire community. In teaching the next generation, elders remained mentally and spiritually engaged. Adults developed leadership and patience from their children, and young children or teenagers, they grew up with a deep sense of belonging and identity, right? Because the 15-year-old, the 16-year-old, even the 12-year-old, they have something to offer their young sibling who is only 4, 5, or 6. So even though they are being poured into by their parents, they are also pouring into those who they are ahead of. Everyone in the living family has an obligation to those before or ahead of them and those behind them. And so this is the embodiment of that phrase we like to say, each one, teach one, right? So let's talk about reclaiming Kindezi in today's world. How do we move away from the influence of Western family models and reintegrate these African-centered approaches to care and community? One of our great elders and ancestors, Dr. Kobe Kambone, emphasized that Kindezi is the antidote to cultural misappropriation and fragmentation. What did I say at the beginning of the episode? We've been calling others about cultural appropriation, but aren't we appropriating and living a culture that isn't our own as well? This art of caretaking, of family, it's the antidote, right? Instead of lamenting how other cultures borrow from our tradition, we got to focus on actively living our tradition for ourselves. And so we can begin this in a few ways. One, we have to prioritize intergenerational living, right? Valuing the wisdom of elders rather than discarding them. Secondly, we need to create educational spaces that are rooted in African and Black-centered values, where children are taught by their communities rather than relying on solely external institutions that actually live outside of our community and that teach a way of life that is not conducive to our households. 3, we got to start establishing mentorship programs where young adults take responsibility for guiding children just the same as adults for children, right? We have to put these 17, these 18, these 15, even some of these 10-year-olds in positions of power, right? We need to make them feel responsible, and we need to give them ownership, not just in their lives, but in understanding their place in the community. They are children, but they are more grown than other children, which means they have something to offer them. Again, that model of each one, teach one. How are we putting them in positions to teach, right? And lastly, we got to rebuild our family organizational structures to reflect this model, where caregiving is a shared responsibility and not just simply the job of one who has a child. And by embodying these principles, we can shift from merely discussing our history to actively living and restoring it. And so, what's the significance? The significance is that the restoration of Kindezi isn't just some nostalgic practice. It's actually about necessity, right? A collection of families makes a neighborhood. A collection of neighborhoods and the institutions that serve that neighborhood makes a community. And a collection of communities together under the same principles makes a nation. Therefore, the family is the smallest unit of a nation and a civilization. And without strong families, there is no strong community. And without strong communities, we cannot thrive and build for the future of our people. So what's our homework going to be? As we close, I want us to reflect on a few questions. The first question is, how have European ideologies influenced my perception of family? And how can I realign with African-centered values? The second question, what cultural practices can I reclaim to strengthen my connection to community and future generations? The third question, Am I actively participating in Kindezi in some form, right? Are you actively participating in the nurturing, the educating, and the valuing of our children? And then fourth, how do I honor and elevate the roles of elders in my life and community? I can be totally honest, y'all. Like, I came through a time in my life in college once I felt like my parents weren't around, my ego got inflated. That's how some of the European ways inflicted me. My ego totally got inflated. So firstly, I want to shout out my family, because without them, like, I wouldn't be here. Shout out to my mother, my father, my sisters and brothers, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, right, and plenty more. The European ideology had me feeling like I was doing this all by myself and that I had been doing it for a while. I was a first generation college student, this and so many other that's that like I've forgotten because I've taken them out. But it was a long time where I felt like I was guided myself, and that's not true at all, right? And so second, I'm reclaiming the cultural practices and African values by a phrase we like to say, sitting at our elders' feet, right? I mentioned that my ego was inflated in the past. And so sitting at my elders' feet has been an act of humility for me and an act of reverence, right? Whereas in a lot of European cultures, they're sending the old over to nursing homes to be taken care of by other people's children who aren't even taking care of their parents and are doing this just for a job. No, I'm gonna go especially in person and say that irregardless of how much that I'm learning or maybe doing, they've done more living than me because they're older than me. And as a result, I'm gonna sit down with them more and absorb their stories and their lessons, which allow me to intimately get into that intergenerational transmission of knowledge and wisdom, right? Like, I'm also actively participating in Kindezi, yes. My sister Deja, she recently had 2 children. And so shout out to my niece Luna and my nephew Soul. And they have truly amplified my life's mission so much, right? Anytime I'm around them, I give them love and care and concern. And I teach them lessons that I've been taught. And I help them work through their emotions so that they can better take mastery of their lives, right? They've also inspired me to create a system of decolonizing curriculum so that no matter who may be teaching them at various points in their lives, they have a way of filtering out matters that are contradictory to their cultural foundation, which helps keep their minds, their spirits, and their imagination safe, right? Shout out to my brother Solomon. He's younger than I am, and as he's moving through high school now, he's also created the ability or given me a responsibility to love on him more. As a child, I used to ask for a little brother. And so now that I have one, I have to be more creative in taking in the responsibility of how to lead him, how to guide him in this movement of manhood that he is a part of, right? Because there's many pressures that exist outside of our house to make us as Black men be less than who we are. And so how am I teaching him about what he is yet to understand and preparing him for that reality? And lastly, I honor and elevate the role of elders in my life, like I said, by seeking out their wisdom and truly listening to them. Because the world that we're in right now, many of them feel unheard and unappreciated, and simply lending your ear to the life force that is within them brings them so much life. And so in closing, y'all, our greatest strength has always been our ability to sustain ourselves in unity with one another. And the more that we return to our ancestral ways, the more resilient we become in the face of all these external challenges. Like, we were born on Earth at a time where there are 7 billion people. Put simply, we're not meant to exist in isolation. Like, we are meant to exist in the fullness of community, where each person has a role and a significance, and each generation supports the next, the ones that came before and the ones that are being ushered in after them. And so this episode is a call to action to restore our family structures, to reclaim our cultural inheritance and to embrace Kindezi as a guiding principle for family and for community growth. Right? We've spent many years appropriating others' cultures. So yes, it's time for us to appropriate ours for ourselves. As always, it's a beautiful time to share in community with you. And if this episode has touched you, I ask that you share it with someone who you believe needs to hear it, right? Let them know what the homework is. And how about you all exchange answers together? And then come back and put it in the chat so that we can all see what we're working through and how we can grow together in community. With that being said, I'll see you all next week. So it is, and so shall it be.